My name is Christina Crook, and I am the author of The Joy of Missing Out. I want to welcome you to the JOMOCast, a podcast for individuals who want to learn how to thrive in a digital age. JOMO is the joy of missing out on the right things. Things like toxic hustle, comparison, and digital drain to make space for life-giving commitments to people and work that bring us peace, meaning, and joy. Jumana Abu-Ghazaleh is the founder and president of Pivot for Humanity. This comes after a diverse and winding career in advertising, marketing, digital design, and entrepreneurship, which Jumana decided to synthesize into a mission focused on bringing ethical reform to the tech industry through professionalization, creating a body of shared community standards and oversight, just as the medical and legal industries have done. Today's interview with Jumana has taken on a double purpose for me, as I reflect upon the broader implications of the topics we discuss for our present moment. I've been particularly reflecting on her words when she said, "You have to earn the trust of people to share with you what it's like to be them out in the world." It's a valuable realization for me that Jumana's mission of creating a more ethical tech industry and instilling humanity-focused values on the tech that shapes our lives begins in all areas with empathy, learning, listening, getting as close to seeing through each other's eyes as we possibly can. There are many, many worthy ideals we can serve successfully when we begin from such a foundation. I hope you enjoy my conversation for the absolute polymath that is Jumana Abu-Ghazaleh. Jumana, thank you for being with me today.
Thanks for having me. I'm so excited to be here.
So Jumana and I met at the All Tech is Human Summit last year here in New York. And all the things she was saying on the panel, I just was aggressively nodding. And she introduced me to this idea that I'd never heard of before, which is digital friction. And I was quite captivated by this idea of creating more friction in our digital lives, making things more difficult to do. And I hadn't really considered the idea of that being a design problem. So maybe if you could start off by telling people what digital friction is.
Yes. So we've grown up in a world where experiencing things being smooth and easy to do is the way to go. That's kind of like the highlight or the measure of good design. How easy is it for the user? And a lot of times we don't realize that means that makes an activity sort of thoughtless or mindless. And so removing friction was thought of as a really great user experience design ethos and is the foundation of a lot of the ways we interact on the web. But that means we're engaging with things without thinking about them, almost sort of we're on autopilot when we're doing it. So the easier you take this out of the digital realm, right? The easier you make it for somebody to swipe their credit card, the more often they'll swipe it, right? That's one of the big interesting things that happened when a shift when people stopped writing checks and started using their credit card. So you're not actually seeing the number that's leaving your account. And the idea was born that friction is bad and that anything that comes between the customer or the user and immediate gratification is a terrible thing. And so as a result, when you remove obstacles, you remove kind of all of the levels of intimacy and understanding and possibility actually that would be possible had the friction been there. So if you think about, again, friction outside of the digital world, you have to rub sticks together to make a fire. You have to do all kinds of, when you're in a relationship with somebody, this idea that it's supposed to be easy is actually wrong because then you might as well date yourself.
Right.
Anytime you want to grow, you want some friction. You want somebody to push you and say, wait, are you sure? Or where did you find that? Or how do you think that? And that's where growth comes from. Growth comes from friction. Understanding, openness comes from friction. Experience really begins at the edge of your comfort zone. So if it's something that you're used to doing, whether it's flavors, if you're tasting something new, is friction. It's taking you outside of something that you know. And so in the digital world, it's all of a sudden anything that is more than one click is considered friction. That means that's too much work for the user to do. That takes too long, or it takes too much thought. And that's seen as a disincentive for users. Like, so that pushes you away from the product. And that means that my job is to make it easier for you to say yes, always easier for you to say yes. Actually, the easiest thing is for you not to even recognize that you're saying yes, to just be in it.
Wow. Okay. I want to take about 18 steps back and talk about how you came to be, let's say, at the All Tech is Human Summit last year. So take us through your career in the different iterations into where you are today.
Yeah. Okay. Well, it's not a straight line. So
It never
I've
is.
encountered a lot
It
of friction.
never is. Yes.
Let's see. I majored in literature and philosophy for undergraduate. So I love books. I love ideas. I love narrative. I love expansive thinking. I love diving into other people's stories. And worked a couple of years and then went to business school. Business school was really, really difficult for me. It was very different from the way I'm used to thinking and operating, and the measures of success were really different. So it wasn't about philosophical debate or understanding or going deep. It was about understanding a certain set of tools and a certain set of lingo, and feeling
So much
comfortable using
lingo.
it. So much lingo. So much lingo. But I went to business school, and it was really hard. But I really do think I learned more than anybody else in my class, because for me it was such a hurdle. It was such a new environment, and it was exercising different muscles. So it was a really interesting sort of balancing out of right brain and left brain for me, having gone from literature and philosophy to this sort of environment of data and statistics and regression analysis and fact. And so while I was there, I was thinking, well, what's a good way to combine this left brain and right brain kind of that I'd nurtured. I didn't want to lose one or the other. And thinking about it, this in retrospect might sound ridiculous, but I was like, I know, advertising. So, it was like, it's a creative space, and it's also a business. And so it felt like a good place to sort of marry the two. And talk about friction then too. Having gone from business school, I got rejected by basically every ad agency in New York City. I packed up my stuff. I moved over here feeling super confident. I had a Harvard MBA. It was going to be great. No one would talk to me.
Why?
Well, they called it the suit factor.
Because you weren't wearing one?
No, because they thought the business school meant I was wearing one, whether it was visible or not. So it was interesting that, thinking that you entered this environment that's going to open doors actually closed a bunch for me. And it was, they said, oh, you come from business school. You think you're going to know everything. You don't have a creative bone in your body. You're going to want to fix everything. And this is about being messy and all that kind of stuff.
Like, I can do messy.
Yeah,
literature.
Right. Oh, I tried. I was like, oh, well, just hire me and don't pay me. And they're like, we're not allowed to do that. So it was for a year. It was like, wow, it was a humbling sort of, setback. But anyway, I found my way in, and working in advertising was fascinating. It was like, I've never done it, but a lot of people talk about, mind expanding drugs. And in a lot of ways it was like that, because you get to fully experience what it's like to be other people, or as close to that as possible. In advertising, in my role, I was what they call a planner or a strategist. And our job was to sort of understand, connect the dots between the user, customer, consumer, the product or business or brand, and the market. And so in the most literal way, it was like, how closely can I embody another human being? So I had to learn what it's like to love cars. If you want to work on those kinds of things, you can't like speak for people and not get where they're coming from. And so I got to sort of wear these different roles, and it was like playing characters in a movie a lot of the time. Just sort of method acting.
So how do you go about that?
A lot of research, but up to a point. I think the most important thing is an openness to otherness, and this if you go in with any preconceived notions, then those are going to limit your ability to sort of grasp the world from somebody else's point of view. And so it's interesting when you start working on things like, we're all typecast, just like actors, in all of life. But in that field too, you're just like, okay, so as a woman, you tend to be put in fashion things or, like that kind of space. And I was really fortunate to be able to work on things like technology, like financial services, like automotive. And it's kind of like being in the middle of nowhere. It's like it's humbling to be in an environment where you feel so completely out of your depth because you don't understand what motivates people. You don't understand what makes them interested and excited. And so that as long as you're curious, I think that's the basic sort of requirement for doing that kind of work. And then to say, okay, if I understand, it makes me think of a lot of different things. And, a little bit where it can get dangerous. You hear about these undercover people who go into these drug dens, and all of it is about what is it like to be one of you, and doing that, and then taking the time to shed that persona and then put on another one is a really gratifying experience, and it's a real opportunity for me to learn not just about other businesses, but to become a sort of more thoughtful, kinder person. So you start with you spend a lot of time talking to people who aren't like you. You research a lot. You try to make holes in your own arguments. There are a lot of ways. So if you're working on cars, you spend a lot of time in garages. You spend a lot of time at auto shows. You spend a lot of time in bars. You spend a lot of time in different parts of the country. If you're working on shampoo, there were times when I would sit in a
salon or
quietly as people were behind the curtain as somebody was taking a shower. Like you try to really get as close as possible to what it's like for the person to be them when they're experiencing the product you're trying to talk about. And it takes a lot of trust. It takes a lot of time, and that's the fundamental thing. You have to earn the trust of people to share with you what it's like to be them and out in the world. And so I got to do that over and over in different forms. And it was exciting and exhausting and hopeful and terrifying all at once. And so when I was at advertising agencies, it was actually interesting, not just because I was working with understanding these groups of people that I had no connection to, but also within the advertising space itself. So I was working with creative people and account people and business people, and sort of seeing all of the kinds of stuff it takes to create something together. At the end of the day, you might think advertising is a silly business, but it takes a lot of different kinds of people to make that work. And it takes a lot of compromise. It takes a lot of debate. It takes a lot of negotiation. It takes a lot of back and forth. And it takes a lot of trust between the people working together. There are a lot of late nights, a lot of arguments. And then I decided, when I went freelance relatively quickly after I started, this is a long, long time ago, but I went freelance. And so I started working at a time when still you would work freelance, but a lot of it was on site. And so you still worked with the team a lot. And so I was able to build relationships with them. And then over time, as the gig economy sort of became more popular and efficiency started to sound like a better idea, like remote work meant lower cost and less friction. I started to do a lot of the work I was doing remotely. And I started to feel really the consequences of that, a real meaningful impact. And in the form of not distrust, but having to very actively build trust, go out of my way to build trust with the people who were entrusting me with their work. So when you're not in the office with somebody, when somebody can't see you work or puzzle through something or get a sense of who you are as a person, and it's much harder to sort of believe the work that they give you when they give it to you. So I went from somebody that, as assume that I was part of a team to somebody who had to prove that the stuff that I was sending in a deck was coming from a credible source. I was invisible largely. They might have heard me on the phone once in a while. There would be emails going back and forth, but they didn't have a sense of person. And so I started thinking, like, watching the world and seeing how many more people were working away from the team that they were working with physically, and what that looked like, and understanding, and started looking at all of the tools that existed to feed this remote work frenzy. And all of them were designed to actually minimize human contact. So it was, even though we call them collaboration tools, they're actually sort of like, it puts everybody on the calendar, and then you can see who's working on what, and you can schedule time with them. But also, because it's a calendar app, the time scheduled is capped, and we're all busy. And so everything is sort of about minimizing the time you actually spend with people. And then all of these articles and studies come out about how meetings are a waste of time and brainstormings are a waste of time. And you end up experiencing things when there are conference calls with people, and legitimately people think they're doing each other a favor when they don't chit chat. It's like, I don't want to waste your time.
Yeah.
So let me just get to it.
Like, we have the agenda beforehand. We drop right in. We don't waste an extra minute of your time.
Right.
Efficiency is king.
Efficiency is king. And then I sort of started experiencing this personally. So, a lot of there's in agencies and a lot of other businesses, obviously, there are offices that are spread across the country and across other geographies. But, so the folks who were in New York would get together and come into the room, get ready for a conference call, and be like, "Oh, hey, how are you? Did you see that show? How was it?" And there'd be a little banter, and they'd get that out of the way and be like, "All right, are we done? Let's dial in Bob in LA." And so they dial in Bob in LA, and then it's all business from there. So the team on the ground has a chance to sort of tune into this culture and connect with each other and think of each other as human beings. And then poor Bob in LA is kept out of that. And that's a tricky thing. And they're thinking they're being respectful of Bob's time, but what they're realizing is that they're excluding Bob. And this kind of thinking, orienting all of our thinking to being busy and being respectful of time, and that anything that doesn't actually contribute immediately to the bottom line is actually not just inefficient, but pointless, was very popular for a while. But you could also see that it was impacting how people felt about the work they were doing, and how dehumanizing it was to be. Google did this massive multi-million-dollar study a few years back, multi-year multi-million-dollar study across all Google employees, all offices, to identify what the drivers of the most successful teams at Google. So the teams that performed best, the most productive, most innovative teams at Google, what characteristics drove those teams? And the number one characteristic by far was not, intelligence or years on the business or diversity of the team even, or diversity of experience. It was something called psychological safety. Psychological safety, in a nutshell, is trust, the sense that you feel like I have your back and you have mine, that it's okay for me to not always be on top of my game, that I am human and I have frailties, that I don't have to leave those behind when I come into work, that this environment is psychologically safe, that I can make a mistake and not worry that you're going to stab me in the back or reprimand me for it, that the rest of my life matters, that if I am having trouble in my marriage or in my relationships or need some time, that's not going to reflect negatively on me as an employee or as a member of this team. And so psychological safety was this idea that when teams feel psychologically safe together, they also, members of that team will say things they won't say when they don't feel safe. That means they take risks. That means they come up with new ideas. That means that they will go further with ideas that sound crazy and not dismiss each other for them. And so, it was really interesting because Google identified this, and it's just psychological safety is a concept that comes out of Harvard and MIT. But it's interesting when a company like Google identifies that and you say, okay, so we need to foster psychological safety. But how do you do that at scale? Psychological safety is something that happens when a group of people know each other well enough to trust each other, which means it's constraining by default. And so you think like, okay, it's you build safety across teams, but what happened? How do you do that when your teams aren't sharing space? When they're not seeing each other eye to eye, when they can't see that you're tired, when they can't ask the right question, when they don't have the context. And so that was a thing that became interesting to me and led to sort of me starting BetwixtUS, which is a trust building tool for teams that, for distributed teams, for teams who don't work together in the same space. And the whole idea is basically adding inefficiency into like very efficient process, adding friction, adding ways for people who don't get a chance to see each other or shake each other's hands or hear a tremor in the voice or see a flicker in the eye to get to know each other. And the premise of BetwixtUS is Old English for between, so between us. So the idea is what's between us? What differentiates us? What makes us the same? What makes us different? And how can we figure that out? And the premise is as human beings, we get to find out what's betwixt us through conversation. Just like we're having. I speak, you ask me a question, I hear you nod, or I see you react puzzled, and so I stop talking or ask a question. And so conversation is how human beings get to know each other. And our view is at BetwixtUS was conversation is what needs to happen for remote teams for them to do innovative, productive work, for them to care about the things that they're building. They need to care and trust each other. So how can people who never see each other, who don't even understand each other's environment, build trust? And that was our goal. And what we found over and over was, the community, the startup community, the technology community, the venture capital community, over and over saying, it's not a viable proposition because it's not something you can do at scale. And that's what we're interested in doing. You don't build trust at scale. Trust requires friction. Trust requires disagreement. Trust requires time. And if you're not willing to give it time, then you can't expect to reap its rewards. And so, having gone from understanding very personally the importance of building real trust with people and being personally involved and coming up with really cool stuff with people I can freely disagree with, to trying to get the idea across that we're losing sight of the fact that we're building all of these tools and none of these tools take that into account. That everything that we're building in this digital age is designed to minimize human contact and human exchange and conversation and conflict even. That removing conflict is seen as a good thing, whereas that's where good ideas come from, is from pushback. It's somebody challenging your thinking and allowing for diversity of thought and diversity of perspective. And so I was starting to be disheartened by the reaction I was getting, because it was like, but trust is really important. Everybody agrees until,
it's not scalable.
Exactly. And so, when I started hearing about all tech is human, and I had been working on trying to get BetwixtUS to say, well, I'm trying to make tech human. And having that experience of that tech space is actually the reason why I started Pivot for Humanity alongside of BetwixtUS. So Pivot for Humanity is a nonprofit with a singular mission, and that is to professionalize big tech. And what does that mean? Professionalization is not a word that you hear often. Probably people under 30 may not even know what it means, because we haven't had to think about professions in a really long time. But today, big tech, social tech, data-driven, data-powered, ad-driven technology is the seat of power. A lot of how we live our lives, what we believe, how we think, who goes to jail, who gets the job, who wins an election, who goes to war, why they go to war. All of that is determined by by our use of social media and by those who control the data, which is the most valuable asset on earth. There is nothing more valuable than data. And the people who determine what gets done with that data are a small group of largely male, largely white, young folks in Silicon Valley. And that's tremendous power that they have. And with that kind of power, there should be some sort of responsibility, some sort of accountability. And all of these, all of this technology started in a time of expansion. And we were all so enamored with this idea of possibility of creating global community. And intentions were all good. Let's all believe that they were all good from the beginning. But at some point, when you add money and you add venture capital and you add KPIs, things get muddied. And when you start, working around move fast and break things, it means that you don't care about what exists and you don't care about whether what the thing that you're breaking was good enough to begin with or not. All you care about is moving fast and breaking things. And I know that's, Facebook will say they've moved away from that. And it's not just Facebook. It was kind of the ethos of the entire of Olive Valley, of all of startup culture. Even if they've moved away from it, you don't change culture overnight. That runs deep.
So for those who've never heard that term, because there's people listening that are not necessarily in the tech space, what does that mean? Move fast and break things.
Move fast. Well, yeah, it means build things. First of all, disrupt. Build new things and put it out there and get a lot of people to use them. Get people excited to use them. It means don't worry about the rules. Just go out there and if it gets people hooked on it or if it makes money, then it's a good thing. Ignore the systems that exist today, whether they're laws or morals or societal norms. They don't matter. What matters is creating something new and making it popular. That's essentially move fast and break things.
Right. And then figure out a monetization model as quickly as possible.
Right. And, move fast and break things is exciting. It's also dangerous, is intoxicating. As you can imagine going as a kid and saying that, like, how you weren't, all those things you're not allowed to do, and all those people that told you have to wait till you grow up, ignore all of that. It's just a free for all. Just go for it.
And here's all the money to do it.
Yeah, exactly. And we'll protect you if something happens, so don't worry about it. I mean, that's a risk-taking culture, and risk is good in some cases as long as it's thoughtful. And we didn't think about putting the thoughtful part of that. It didn't say move fast and thoughtfully and break things as necessary. We said move fast and break things.
Right.
And the thought that, a few guys who like to code can create and shape society by creating the digital infrastructure of society. What they're creating today, what Facebook is, what Twitter is, what Amazon is the equivalent of, the Brooklyn Bridge. It's a massive undertaking. And if you're building the Brooklyn Bridge, I would expect you to think about the risks involved in that. People are going to be driving over it, walking over it. What happens if it breaks? What do we need to do to make sure it doesn't break? How do we protect it from people who want it to break? Those kinds of things. A civil engineer is a professional, just much like a doctor is. A doctor is a professional. Way back when, your doctor was this like frontier surgeon who would like cut off your arm and tell you to, pour some scotch on it. But the beauty is, at one moment in time, a few medical practitioners came together and said, some of us want to do the right thing and heal. Our goal is to heal people, to help them. And others don't. And there should be a way to tell the difference. And the way to tell the difference is professionalization. We are willing to take an oath. That doesn't mean that we're a nonprofit. That doesn't mean that we're not going to make, doctors, we all know, are some of the...
Make a healthy living.
Yes.
They're doing okay.
They're doing okay. But they're doing okay while having, taken an oath and signed a social contract with society. They have another North Star. They don't just have make money. They have make money while healing. And in a lot of ways, it actually helps the practitioners themselves, the idea of professionalization, because it allows the professionals, the practitioners, to say no to things they're not comfortable doing. It gives them room. It gives a technologist room to say, that product is not ready to go to market. I know it can scale really quickly, but the risks are really high. And I took an oath.
Right.
So it allows me a way to define my boundary and to hold on to my values. Otherwise, I have to give in to the pressure. Otherwise, we're constantly hearing criticism of technologists and the people who make these technologies, saying that they're responsible, but in a lot of ways, they're doing exactly what we're asking them to do. We're asking them to increase shareholder value at all costs, and that's exactly what they're doing. And so long as there's no other reason for them to exist except for increased shareholder value, they're going to continue doing that. Now, you look back on all these origin stories and the myths of creation in the tech space, and they all come from really good places. They come from people wanting to see a better world. They come from people who say, I want more for my community. I want to connect people. Imagine if people didn't feel alone, or information should be accessible to everybody. Google wanted to, organize the world's information, make it accessible to everybody. That's a really noble thought, along with don't be evil. But if you take away don't be evil, and you're being funded by, this is where my past, my present, my future collide. Because I'm come from advertising. I understand that world. I understand how it works. And I understand that in a lot of ways it does a lot of good. But you have to think about the role advertising has as a funder of society. You have to think about their interests. These are also interests. So when Google makes most of its money on advertising, a lot of what it does, whether it's organizing the world's information and making it more accessible, is designed to please the people, those advertisers,
right?
Which turns us into product. Pivot for Humanity's point of view is pivot. This idea of pivoting is something that's very common in the startup tech world. You go to market, you learn something from market, you come back, you pivot, you think you were going to be something, but you realize you're going to be something else. And our point of view is that the big tech as a whole, this data-driven tech as a whole, needs to pivot, and the pivot needs to be from this free-for-all space where anything goes, of these rogue practitioners, to a space that is professionalized, a space that cares about the outcomes and doesn't think of them just in after they happen. It's a way for practitioners of the tech space to stop over relying on on the phrase unintended consequences,
right?
And to say, look, as a professional, you can still create, you can still do wonderful things, but you will have, for a compass, you'll have your compass of, what is your role in society? What is that you hope to give? Let me take a step back. So the reason why it's important for the whole industry to pivot, like medicine did, like lawyers did, like financial services did, and not to say that these are all blameless. There are issues that professionalization alone can't solve, but what happens when an industry or trade professionalizes is that it unifies the people, and so the practitioners. So it stops being, it levels the playing field enough that everybody has to play by the same rules. If you look at the world today, we're constantly looking at Apple and Facebook are primary examples of this. Twitter recently is on the page too. They're all knocking each other on social media, saying who's doing it right, who has values, who doesn't have values. That's because it's all up in the air.
Right.
What professionalization does is create a unifying vision for the whole sector, for the whole trade. And so it takes away this pressure to beat somebody to to market on something because it allows everybody to operate from the same set of rules. So professionalization starts with a unifying vision for the whole trade. They come together and say, as a group, we believe our role in society is this. That's number one. And manifestos come from that. Oaths come from that. The second thing that comes from that is this idea that based on this social contract we have with humanity, here are the standards we believe we should uphold. You define them, so they vary across different sectors. Even in medicine, they vary across different medical fields. But you start with a unified vision. You codify that vision. So what are the standards that when you say you figure out how to train people, prepare people? So what kind of certification is required? And this is where it becomes interesting. I'll get back to this if we have time in the tech sector. And then the fourth thing is how do you enforce, right?
Right.
You want to enforce these because it doesn't matter if these values aren't enforceable, then they're not really meaningful. And so it's important that, when people talk about the values that Facebook has or Google has and how as a culture they adhere by those values, but it doesn't matter if those values shift from company to company. What is the overarching set of values that anybody in this technology, data-driven technology, social technology, will commit to? What's interesting in this case is a lot of times the pushback I get too is like, well, culturally, programmers, hackers, coders, technologists they don't like education. They don't like this idea of certification. It's not like medicine where you have to go through years and years of training and education before you know how to wield a knife or a scalpel or understand how the body works. All technologists need to know is how to code.
Is that how you define a technologist, like in the way that you're using it?
It's a broad term. I mean, there are so many different ways to define it. Pivot for Humanity's focus specifically on extractive technologies. So technologies that use of our behavioral data, technologies that turn us into products.
Yeah.
So the technologists who work in that space are, I think of them as anybody who touches the creation of the product. So including the VCs who fund them. So anybody who makes possible the products that the technologies that turn us into products. There's a lot of refining of that term that needs to happen, but I think this is why these conversations are important today. Technology used to be, I don't know if it ever was. I think we used to think of it as a very different thing. We used to think about the wonders of technology, and technology seemed so foreign and so visible, but now it's it's not something we touch or can marvel at as human beings. It operates in the background. And, one of the things that we need to figure out is what makes a technology, what makes it innovative, or what makes it not. But anyway, I digress. Technologists today, coders, programmers, the employees who go into Facebook and Google and Amazon and Twitter and all of those companies don't necessarily need to have any education. They don't need to have a high school education, let alone a college education. What they need to demonstrate is their fluency with code and being able to speak that language and operate in that language and be creative with that language. And so, from the area of professionalization to say that like, oh no, we require you to go through training is a tall task.
Right. Like you have to have a computer science degree, for example.
Right. Which you don't.
Right.
But that doesn't mean you shouldn't have a set of values or morals. Like we are as human beings understand the value of things like honor systems and honor codes and labels and certificates, even as from things as plain as I don't mean to oversimplify it. It was a complex thing to get to anyway, but you go to the supermarket and you buy an organic apple or an apple that's not organic. And that's a shorthand for understanding some of the things that means.
Right.
We don't have the equivalent of that with technology. With a doctor, you can go to a natural healer alternative medicine if you want, or you go to a doctor and you know what that means.
Right.
With every other field that actually impacts our health and well-being, you can tell it, you can choose how do you interact,
Right.
what you interact with, except in this field. And a huge part of that is saying, is training necessary? Yes. What form it takes is still something that we need to figure out. I don't know. MIT just is doing one of the biggest actually, structural change since MIT introduced the study of the discipline of management in the 1950s. And that's to reorient education at all of MIT around this idea of ethics and liberal arts. It's a sort of a reckoning with the fact that we've spent so much time separating science and technology from all of the rest of life, from history, from geography, from literature, from psychology, from philosophy. And now we are experiencing the blowback from that. We are understanding what it's like for people who have no understanding of what it means to be human, or what it means to be foreign, or what it means to be female, or what it means to be Black, or what it means to be lonely, creating these things in a vacuum and then putting them out in the world. And, MIT is saying that like we have got to change the way we build technologies. We have to build technologies from within society, not outside of it. And so
that's super exciting.
Yes.
I'm thrilled to hear that.
It's very, very exciting. It's a really brave and forward-looking, I think, proposal. The only thing I worry about is that not everybody gets to go to MIT.
Right.
So how do you take that and say, for those who don't go to MIT, but still want to play in this space, still want to be creators in this space, how can we prepare them to be good, creative, thoughtful, responsible, accountable innovators? How do we make it so that it's not elitist? So that it isn't just the people who are able to go to MIT who are seen as qualified. And that's the beauty of something like where it's an opportunity to see how professionalizing the tech space is going to be different than professionalizing the medical space or the engineering space.
What would be the closest comparison? Because I'm right away thinking of the financial sector, only because financial people in finance obviously are trained in a lot of different ways to come to finance. So would that be the closest comparison? Because medicine, right? Most medical schools follow the exact same parameters.
Well, from a professionalization perspective, I'm not trying to be glib, but it's almost irrelevant what the specialty is. The idea is that the profession as a whole, has a North Star or a God that is separate from profit.
Right.
So it's less about the specific field that you take, but that the field that you're in or pursue, but that the field that you pursue is in service of something else.
Right.
And so it's actually more about the ethical training and ethical certification and establishment of values and identification of standards and accountability around those standards.
Right.
So it doesn't actually matter it's not about, did you get your degree? Are you a surgeon or are you an anesthesiologist? You both also pray to a higher power.
To do no
harm.
Yeah.
That's the unifying umbrella.
Right. Would that be the same for, what would it be? What do you envision? Because I'm sure you've thought about it, right? What would be that unifying statement for technology?
Yeah, Christina, I've thought about it a lot. Is it, is it the right direction? No, I've thought about it a lot, but I also do think that it's going to take a lot of people, who actually understand the space from a variety of different perspectives to come up, do something. The American Medical Association started because a group of doctors got together in, I think it was 19, got together and said, we need to figure out how to do this as a group. And then slowly it grows. We similarly need a group of people who are passionate about this, who understand it from the inside, and are willing to bring their varied perspectives to bear. I'd start with saying, the simple thing I'd ask is, are you willing to take an oath? And, what would that oath be? Let's sit around and talk about it.
Mm-hmm.
One of the ways I would think about it is that I think is important to a lens to look through is technology makes easy to do. And this is going back to sort of frictionless and whatever. Ones and zeros create a huge distance between the coder and people. It's kind of like, if you're behind a computer or a device and you're creating a program and you unleash it into the world, you are so far removed from its impact. You're like so far removed from the people. You're not thinking about them. And so the lens I would think it through is like, okay, as you're building this, think about your child using it. Think about your mother, your father, your community, your loved one, your partner. Build it for the people you love and worry about. Tell me how it would become different. What else? What would you do differently if you were building this for your kids?
Mm-hmm.
Would you think differently about how addictive it is? Would you think differently about how people can influence your child's thinking? I think that's, for me, a fundamental question.
Mm-hmm.
We should build things for our own communities before we unleash them into the world.
It's such a stark comparison to your experience in advertising, going into a place which is not something I would have ever considered for the advertising industry, to have to push yourself so far outside of yourself to consider another person's reality. And that sounds like something that's not happening in the technology space. I mean, like all those classic films, and I'm trying to break this down for the average listener who might not have considered a lot, because we covered a lot already on this whole topic. But the classic film of the hacker, right, at home, even just the movie Hackers, right, with the stream, or the Matrix, right, like with the streams of ones and zeros, and the classically completely like the loner, right, at home, having no contact with humanity. Like that is the problem that you're talking about, in terms of this person is completely devoid of human contact, not seeing how it's going to play out, and there just being so many steps between that person and ultimately the product in the world. That to me seems like a hurdle that's just so enormous in terms of how you get a person, like that's reframing even the way that teams work, right? In terms of, let's have someone in the room that's like actively using it in front of the coder. And like, is that something that you envision? Like, would that be the ideal of like all those team members working more closely together? Like you're seeing, like the coders seeing the potential user in the room, and like, instead of all those teams being so separate? Because isn't that how most technology companies work?
Yeah, there are a lot of ways. I think, and that's why sort of I want to embark on this professionalization journey with people who can sort of help reframe and restructure how this works from the inside. There are a lot of code is written in a vacuum, and I think that in large part, that's not, that's by design, right? Because I know from my experience on Pivot for Humanity, with Pivot for Humanity and our communications, that there are a lot of people who are working at those companies who are uncomfortable with the things that they are building. But they don't have a way to press that because of the NDAs that they've signed. They also don't know what to look for. They don't know how to know that it's bad. They sometimes don't know where it's going until it's too late.
Right.
So when I say by design, it's that if somebody says to you, I need you to build something that increases engagement in this set of tools, and your view of it is very limited, you just experiment until you figure it out, and then you pass it along. For you, that's a success.
Right.
You've done your job, and you've done it really well.
And that turns into real-time updates on Facebook on the right-hand column that probably, increased user time by like 200%.
Right. And nobody asked you to say, what do you worry about if you're putting this? What should we think about as?
Right.
And so I think that it absolutely getting teams to work together to humanize the users, more transparency, obviously more power worker power, I think, is really important because fundamentally, when what I learned in business school, interestingly, even though, as I said, my background was in literature and philosophy, what I learned in business school was that everything comes down to human beings and ego and relationships. You can talk about things in spreadsheets. You can, talk about bottom lines. You can do all kinds of analysis. Ultimately, people make decisions, and they make them because they either feel good or scared or strong or worried or in love, or insulted. Wars start because most of what we do isn't rational. We are emotional beings. And to think that technology or businesses stand outside of that is an illusion. In all of the cases we did at Harvard, it was always like, what is the motivation of somebody? And how does somebody relate to that person? Okay, how do I tell you that I wasn't able to make the deadline? And what are the consequences of that? So at the end of the day, people build technologies and people direct people to build technologies. And what we need to make sure that we all remember is that people also build technologies for other people. Pivot for humanity is the humanity word is, not an accident, not accidental in there. It's to say that we're not robots. We don't operate like robots.
Right.
We shouldn't within the company. We shouldn't with each other. And we shouldn't as we create for the future. And so I think at the fundamental basis of any profession, be it medicine or the law or hopefully social tech, that the heart of it is what is the right thing to do for people, and what is it going to take for you to make that matter to you? So if it takes you thinking about your wife or your husband or your partner or your child, your community.
I'm writing down what is the right thing for people.
It sounds like a ridiculous thing, but I think ultimately it's to say, we need to remind each other of our humanity. And a lot of this technology, I imagine Zuckerberg is so far, I'm making this up, but he's a human at home with his wife and kids and completely doesn't see humanity when he's at work.
Right.
They're different things.
Yeah.
And we need to bring him closer to doing stuff that's good for people, not things that are good for the bottom line.
But as long as they're publicly traded companies, is there any way to get away from that? Because I'll just humanize it for a minute. So my husband is a senior vice president of product marketing for a real estate technology company. Mm-hmm. They're publicly traded global leader in their industry. And every single quarter, no matter how much they rock that quarter, is irrelevant because the next quarter they have to gain. Right. And every step backward, being straight across, just doing okay is always a loss. It has to always be a gain. And as long as that's true, as long as investors are wanting to see gains, and you probably invest in things, most people are invested in something, and we want to see, is there a way? I'm thinking of Mark now. I'm thinking of humanizing Mark Zuckerberg. So, right, publicly traded company. He needs to see those gains for, is it possible for us to, going back to your question, what is best for people? What is the right thing for people? Is it possible for us to really have that question at the heart of what we're doing when ultimately it's in service of a corporation that needs to make money?
Is it possible? I would say yes. And to do what I'm doing, I'd have to believe absolutely yes. Is it easy? That's a different question.
Yeah.
Is it straightforward? That's also a different question. There are finance companies. There are lots of publicly traded companies that have fiduciary duty. I'm not saying you can't keep going up, although we can talk about capitalism on another episode. But there's also by how much, right? And who's determining, and how are we defining value? When we introduced when the world started playing around with triple bottom lines, that change the value equation a little.
Mm-hmm.
So this is absolutely not about, saying that everybody should become a nonprofit or, not trade publicly. It's putting meat behind what the Business Roundtable recently released, the statement it released and said, we should shift the notion of success from, solely a profit to shareholders. Now, all of that started, that's another conversation, and with, Milton Friedman, and thinking of that's the sole responsibility of businesses, is to make money for shareholders. And so that's a relatively new thought. It's taken off, but it's not something that's been here for thousands of years. And so is it possible to change? Yes. And I think that it will happen, not because many people care, but because many people will have to care. If you look at the planet and there are so many reasons to think about how we need to recast what growth looks like.
Yeah.
So growth can remain, but how do we define it, and how do we reframe it for stakeholders and not just shareholders, but also for shareholders? I'm not saying you shouldn't make money. Everybody wants to make money, but and you're seeing that a lot in the national political debate. How much is enough? Like, who needs to make $50 billion?
How much is enough is a great question. Jumana, thank you so much for being with me today. Lots to unpack.
Yeah, thanks for listening to all of it. I know I meandered, but that's
No, it's good. It's a big topic. I think people that typically listen to the JOMOCast, this is definitely a topic that they probably have never considered before. I think part of why I love what you're doing is actually like this complete moonshot for tech. And I believe that this should happen. I think so many of us are just at a level where we're consuming and we're struggling, but we really don't believe that our voice or actions can affect meaningful change, because these tech companies are so massive. And so to have someone like you who's like calling them into accountability and having conversations with people that can make those types of decisions, to me, is very empowering.
I'm so happy to hear that, because I do feel one more soapbox statement, that there is a lot of dialogue about putting the responsibility in the hands of consumers, and I don't think that's fair. I don't think that's right, and I don't think that's realistic. I think that's a Band-Aid, and I think it's an excuse. So I'm here to say that, like, it's not a lot to ask. It's not a lot to ask the people who are creating these technologies to care about the people that are using them, to take an oath.
And have accountability.
That's right.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening. You can learn more about our guests in the show notes and by visiting JOMOCast.com. The JOMOCast is edited and music composed by Thomas J. Inge. Visit Tom online at tinge, that's TINDGE.com, to learn more about Tom and his services. The JOMOCast is listener supported. Sign up as a patron at patreon.com/JOMOCast. Patreon support makes the podcast possible. For just $3 a month, you will keep these conversations going. That link again is patreon.com/JOMOCast. Don't forget to subscribe to the podcast with your provider of choice. And if you loved this episode, leave us a 5-star review. These reviews are a powerful way you can help us reach more listeners. I'm your host, Christina Crook. Thanks for listening, and may you find joy missing out on the right things.